Here's the Spectral Multiband Resonator from 4MS. I'll talk through the features fairly quickly for this, as there's a really good manual directly from 4MS that I suggest you go and look at. We'll get into these features in some musical examples to follow, but first up we've got 20 notes in a scale around that ring of LEDs. We can select which 6 of those are active, shown by those LEDs. We've got a morph knob that smoothly changes between these values. At its highest setting, you can think of this as being really heavily slewed, and there's a long lag that moves between the values. We've got resonance, which makes these bands fully resonant sine waves as opposed to more EQ-like in function. Here's that morph again. There's a spread control to spread those 6 voices around the notes available in the scale. And the movement in the spread's affected by the morph as well. There's an odd and even input, and with no input present, we've got noise normal to the input. There's also an odd and even output, so we can go stereo in to stereo out, mono in to mono out, or mono in to stereo out. We've got CV over the morph and spread as well as resonance. We've got a switch that allows the scales to rotate when this goes fully clockwise around its values, so here's a single resonating band. If I spin this all the way around with the switch off, we'll get the same notes. But with the switch rotate on, we'll get different notes as we run around this ring of LEDs. Hopefully you can hear that those notes are different. These are different intervals depending on the scale settings. We've got scale CV, envelope follower outputs per band, which are on this black strip of outputs. You can see with the fast envelope follower setting, the LEDs flash and show the activity. Or we can have a slow and slewed envelope follower for greater, more subtle modulation outputs. Or this can be used just as a straight trigger out, which is a high signal when that band is active. There's then pre and post envelope following. With pre, regardless of each band's level, the unit will have active envelope followers responding to the input. With a post, it's dependent on the band's settings on the module. We've got a lock button per band. And you can lock these bands so they don't change frequency, and notice that this LED now flashes too. Taking off lock, we've got a different spread setting, so we can adjust that back again. There's frequency nudging for the odd bands on the left and the even bands on the right. There's a switch to adjust whether this affects just the first band or all of the odd numbered bands. Here's the first one. And then all of them. The frequency input tracks 1 volt per octave, and there's also an input to trigger the locking and unlocking of those bands. There's a rotate CV input which follows a modulation signal's wave shape, as well as a forward clock rotating input for triggers and clocks and gates to move clockwise around the ring of LEDs, or an anti-clockwise input to reverse backwards around that ring of LEDs and settings. We've got CV inputs for each level control for those sliders, and those sliders become a level attenuator with an input present for that CV, and there's also a switch to add a slew to that level control. The slew's great for taking out any clicks and pops when you hit a band's level control with a hard gate. So extending the look at these features, let's have a look at the scale settings. Making these bands fully resonate, it's easy to tell what's going on, so these are oscillating bands. You can see a screenshot from the manual, which is going to show you the scales and the bank settings. Pressing the rotate button, we can then flick through one of 11 available scales in that bank and listen to these intervals change. strip of coloured LEDs at the bottom represent a different bank, be that a set of Western scales, Indian pentatonics or microtonal banks. There's lots to get in there and play with. Holding down the rotate button we can change these colours and bank settings. Selecting a new bank, we can then flick through that bank scale options. And you can also create user scales and save those in a user bank, and all this is walked through in the manual for the module. Let's look at using the Spectral Multiband Resonator as a voice by itself. We've got audio inputs, but we can use these with a gate instead of the audio to actually trigger and strike a resonant oscillating band. We've got two sample and hold based random triggers to use as inputs, which will strike those frequency bands. I'm also taking the odd and even bands out, so I've got a stereo output, so make sure you're listening in headphones or some decent speakers so you can hear the stereo image. Turning up the level of the gates coming in. The odd bands are triggered by this side, and how resonant this is dictates how long these bands will ring. We've got the even bands on the other side, and let's mix those together. So we can make up different variations of levels and resonances. That decay and ringing is determined by the resonance amount, and these are being plucked by those triggers at the input. So those little clicky and less resonant sounds are great for percussion sounds with little pops and clicks, especially used alongside more typical drum sounds. Let's spread out these voices in the scale and rotate through that. I've got a sample and hold module being triggered by one of the sample and hold gates that I'm actually striking these bands with. I'm going to take that to generate a sample and hold CV to rotate the scale. With the Morph we can smooth out these values. We could put that into Spread instead. And with some of the added Morph value we can get rid of any clicks or pops when changing the bands in the middle of those ringing, so that we're getting a much slower change. With the Spread and Morph down we can use the rotate trigger ins instead of a clock signal or any gate, and you can smooth this out with a Morph. So let's find a spread of voices that we like. And then click the encoder to change the scale settings. Holding the encoder we can flick into a different bank of scales, and this changes those colours to indicate that change. And I've also got the sample and hold gates triggering those bands at the audio input, triggering some envelopes. I'm going to add those envelopes into the frequency nudge to create some pitch sweeping percussion sounds. Let's make sure it controls all the bands, so I'm just going to go to one side for now. So we're getting those envelope hits. Let's do the same on the other side for the even bands. Here's some more resonance. Sample and hold CV back into the rotate input, and we'll add some Morph again. Turning down the envelopes, modulating the frequency now. And taking this out, I'll add LFO control of the level for one of the bands. These sliders now act as CV attenuators. And let's get this morphing again. We've got the envelope follower outputs per band, and notice that we've got pre and post envelope following, and we've also got a fast and detailed envelope follower setting or a slower, more slewed output. With a fast setting, you can see the LED's intensity is changing, showing the output signal's level, and with that moving and changing, we can patch it back into itself. Let's take the second band's output and patch that into the spread. So it's a little bit crazy, so we can turn up that morph to slow those changes down. And depending on that second band's activity, we'll now get different CV values to the spread. Here's a drum loop, and you're listening to that fully dry at the minute on my mixer. Here's the dry mix down, and now the multiband resonator's output. So we've got the spread, and we can flick through those different bands. Because each of those bands are quite close to each other in that scale, you can see those LEDs are next to each other. Each band isn't massively different, but if we spread those bands out around the notes in the scale, we'll get a wider spread of frequencies. You can use this like a notch EQ and play around with it against a dry unprocessed sound too. And use this like some sort of extreme parallel EQ that works great, or you can make these more resonant. So let's take one of the band's envelope follower outputs and patch it into itself. We'll stick with that fast setting and take it into the frequency input to control itself. Here's some of the dry sound mixed back in. So a little bit of a quirky sound, but it's a great option to have. One thing that works really well with the unsynced and more acoustic based input signals like a live drum loop, where you don't have a clock that's actually generating this content, is to use the envelope follower outputs to control the rest of your setup. I'm listening to these drums and watching what each of those envelope followers is doing. I'm going to attenuate the input level to the module, which is going to affect those envelope followers too. And you can see that second band's LED following the kick and snare in the patch roughly. So let's turn down the drums and use this to trigger a synth sound. Here's that with the drums. So we're getting some interaction and useful information for triggering other sounds, especially when there's no clock present. The audio is just a loop from the Music Fin Modular and Funk Radio Music module. We can try and focus in on other bits of that drum loop, so let's look at the other bands and try and select a frequency that follows the cymbals and the higher frequency content. Playing around with the input level to the Spectral Multiband Resonator and the scale settings for those bands, we can pull out different frequencies from various harmonics and frequencies present in your source material. It's a really cool way of creating dynamic and changing effects with those envelope followers pulling out different details. Let's look at processing some effects and use a big long thick reverb tail. Here's my drive sound, which is a modulated wavetable oscillator into some tube distortion. We've got a random gate opening a VCA on that sound. This is then going into a reverb, and here's mixing that in. Then here's the reverb's output split into the Spectral Multiband Resonator as well. We can go in and make these bands resonant. And nudge the bands. This could be under CV control as well, but I'll first find a bank and scale setting that I like for some dark overtones that add a lot of tension. Let's find some static resonances and then lock these bands. And locking that, we've got two bands locked and not moving when we're rotating around those scale settings. Notice those LEDs flash to show that they're locked. If I use the same random gate that's actually opening and closing the VCA on my source sound, I can get this rotating through the scale in time. Here's spreading those voices. Turning down the resonator's output, here's the reverb on its own. And then mixing in that resonator's output as well. And then some of the dry source sound. There's a little bit of clipping which can happen when you've got high signal levels and really resonant bands, especially when you've got a resonant band set to a frequency that's actually stacking up harmonics in that original source sound as well. The LEDs flash to show that clipping, so it's really easy to rectify it quickly. Let's modulate the level of two of the bands with some random gates. And then mix the reverb signal in. We can modulate the Q setting for the resonance. Hopefully you can see the red LED in that cable shows the positive signals and the yellow LED in that cable shows the negative signals. And we're actually narrowing and widening that Q on each of those bands. Let's add the other bands back in and some scale rotation. And then mix our other reverb and dry sound back in as well. And this is great for creating subtle tensions and resonances amongst your effects. Here you're listening to the sound that we're going to process, and here it is static. Getting that moving, it's a sequence phase distortion sound from an oscillator. This is completely dry, so let's make that sound static again. And take its input to the multiband resonator, and taking my output to come straight from the multiband resonator. We've got the different notes in the scale. And here's spreading out those different notes and voices. These voices spread fairly evenly around the scale notes and no resonance added. We can use it as a more broad EQ. Here's a touch of resonance. And it almost sounds like feedback on this highest band, which is nice. I can immediately take this into stereo, but splitting the sound with the odd and even outputs. Let's get one of the bands moving with an LFO. And I'll now modulate that input sound again. So you can use this as a stereo processor or EQ or frequency band splitting device. It works great in a feedback patch as you can fine tune what you're doing with the different bands. Let's take a sample and hold to modulate the pitch of my oscillator. But this EQ curve we've got is just going to stay static. So listen to this, while resonant, it doesn't move although the input is moving pitch. If we want to move these bands, we can split our pitch sequence, which is a sample and hold, and have that split into both the odd and even frequency nudge inputs. Now listen to those resonances. You can hear they're changing and tracking along with that oscillator's pitch. So it's a great processor for general broad tone control and EQ, along with creating stereo signals as well. I've had loads of fun with just taking a simple oscillator's output and feeding that in for processing, creating tones or moving resonances amongst that sound from the oscillator going in. So that's it for the Spectral Multiband Resonator from 4MS, a very powerful module for both studio sound design or live use. It's definitely a module which you can get lost in and really spend a lot of time having fun and finding new things you can do with it. As I mentioned, check out the manual from 4MS as that's really good, and hit like and subscribe for more videos every week, and check the Patreon link in the description to see how you can support my channel.